Hi, Heather.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing okay. Should we tell people who we are?
We should. I'm Heather Hurlburt from the National Security Network. This is my first ever Blogging Heads in my capacious new office.
Oh, you got a new office?
I did. I moved 3 doors down into an office that I can have more than 3 people in at once.
Excellent. Same building, huh?
Same building, same suite. Just slightly bigger space.
And that's in Washington.
Yeah.
I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. And this conversation was my idea. I wanted to explore this question of whether we are at the beginning of a movie that we've seen before and didn't work out very well. I mean, I'm talking specifically about a comparison between what may turn out to be a prelude to war with Iran and what we know was, in fact, a prelude to the war with Iraq, which really began in earnest about exactly 10 years ago, I would say. I was just watching on YouTube an old Bill Moyers piece about the rise of the neocons, and I saw this footage from exactly 10 years ago. I mean, this week, like late November 2001, and you had Bill Kristol and you had Richard Pearl, kind of, I would say, harnessing the environment of fear and vengefulness in the aftermath of 9/11, and saying, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. We got to do this, and I will link to that Moyers piece. And it just occurred to me that we're hearing from at least some of the same people. Certainly, Bill Kristol's been very out front in the campaign to bomb Iran, and I just wanted to get your take on to what extent we are seeing the same movie, because I think there's some differences as well. And I think you pay closer attention to this stuff than I do. So I wanted to, start off by asking if you've had any thoughts about either similarities or differences.
Yeah, well, I think a way to, if you're picking metaphors for this, it's sort of the same team running the same playbook in a different season against a different opponent, maybe. Mm-hmm. And I think the first foundational point I would make that people need to understand about both Iran and Iraq is that it didn't start in 2001, and the Iran push isn't starting now, and that as somebody who was sitting in the State Department in 1998-99 when there was this never-ending effort to tighten sanctions, tighten the no-fly zone, and the Clinton administration got itself put in this really untenable position between conservatives in Congress wanting to tighten everything up on the one hand, and some of their own base who regarded them as baby killers for what the sanctions were already doing in Iraq on the other hand, and wound up, frankly, making a tactical decision that it was worth giving conservatives what they wanted on Iraq in order to get things like funding UN dues and other initiatives. And, in 1998-99, it seemed harmless enough because nobody could imagine actually going to war against Iraq. And what you're talking about is that after 9/11, sort of the moment came. Mm-hmm. And then, those folks, the neocons are long-term planners, which for the most part progressives are not. And interestingly, the realist community, I would argue, isn't, even though you guys really ought to be, because that's what you say you're all about. But, these folks...
Wait, did you just put me in the realist community?
Oh, am I not supposed to put you in the realist?
I think that's fair. I'm not a conventional realist. I am, as you know, a progressive realist. But I don't think, anyway. Right. Enough about me. You can call me what you want. Go ahead.
Yeah, but the thing that I think for people to, there's the Iran debate right now, there's the sort of similarities and differences debate, which we can go further into, and there's the really how serious is this, how much do we have to worry about it debate. Mm-hmm. And the point that I make to people is, in 1999, nobody ever thought we were going to occupy Iraq, honestly. And I, right now, am not particularly worried about, as things are today, about a war with Iran. But I do think the regional situation is unstable. The Iranians are good at never missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity. You have forces within Iran that actually wouldn't mind ratcheting up confrontation within the U.S. Mm-hmm. There's the whole problem of Israeli politics, which we can also get into, plus the 2012 elections, which, might very well return to office or not return to office, and you could have, I think Bush in his second term figured out that the military option wasn't a good one, but it did take them a while to figure that out. And so I think you could you could see the same thing. So while sort of, do I wake up in the morning worrying about going to war with Iran? No, I don't. But I do see efforts to set the table now, and that, I think, is what's actually the biggest similarity between what happened with Iraq, is that there was an organized campaign by an organized group of folks.
Okay, so what are the signs that the table is being set?
Well, first is this question of framing, which you and I were discussing a little bit in our pre-call. And here, actually, I'd say one of the differences is that, it's pretty indisputable that Iran has hostile intentions toward many of its neighbors and a nuclear program. You can argue about whether they've made the decision to weaponize, how close they are to weaponizing, but you can't argue that they have the program, that they haven't cooperated with the IAEA inspectors, that they've made very threatening noises, not just toward Israel, but also toward the Gulf states. So you have that threat, and then you have a concentrated effort to frame it in such a way that, as the moderator said at the Halifax Security Forum that I was at this weekend, said to Ehud Barak, well, isn't the choice between bombing or letting the Iranians get a weapon? And that's a completely false choice, both because it's not at all clear that it's inevitable that Iran will weaponize, and number two, it's even less clear that we can actually stop them from weaponizing by using force. But the more the choice gets framed that way, the harder and harder it is to argue.
And number three, it's not clear to me, at least, and maybe I have my realist hat on here, but that Iran with either breakout capacity, that is the ability to produce a bomb in relatively short notice in a matter of a couple of months, or an Iran with an actual bomb would be a catastrophe. That's not clear to me. And I think here you get into a part of the framing on the part of the hawks that emphasizes what they're contending is a fundamental irrationality about Iran, which I don't see the suicidal irrationality that is a prerequisite for nuclear deterrence not working myself. But anyway, I wanted to say that that's the third. That this is a premise of the framing, that framing of the choice between stopping them from getting a bomb and peacefully and going to war with them. The unspoken premise is that for Iran to have a nuclear weapon would be a disaster, in some sense that all the other nations that have nuclear weapons having them has not turned out to be a disaster. Okay, that's my intervention. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Now let me lay out an additional layer on top of that and see what you think about it, which is that I think you have a group of folks who really are sort of determined to go to war with Iran. And then you have a larger group of folks who, for both genuine substantive and political reasons, believe that they need to use the threat of war in order to get both substantive traction vis-a-vis Iran and political traction in their own societies. And so you have a group of folks who may know at some level that as Admiral Fallon, Admiral Mullen, General Zinni, and a lot of other uniformed folks have said that military action against Iran has very at best unpredictable, and at worst some quite negative consequences, but who really feel that not talking about it isn't going to get you where you want to go, so that you need to go right up to the edge. And those signals are very hard to decipher, because there's a whole set of actors that I listen to them talk, and I listened to Ehud Barak this weekend, and I genuinely couldn't tell, and I assume that's intentional, but from the point of view of trying to hold American policy steady and trying to keep the debate in the U.S. from getting to a crazy place from which it can't return, that's when you have people who've deliberately decided that they need to use that frame to get where they want to go, it makes the debate extra challenging. And I think we had less of that problem in the war the run up to Iraq. That there were some people who were hoping that Saddam would step down, but I'm not sure. I feel like there's more of that this time around.
Right. So there are more of the people sounding like hawks, maybe wanting to use the threat of war genuinely as a tool by which to avert war. That's in their mind.
Yeah.
I mean, I got to say, one part of that I don't totally understand. I mean, the premise is that if Iran fears that we will attack or Israel attack, they will relent and, I don't know, do whatever we want by way of verifiably not pursuing a bomb. But if I'm the Iranian government, I think I'm kind of liking this sense of siege. You know, I'm not sure that I want Israel to quit threatening me. If I am a leader of Iran who's a little insecure about his domestic political position, I think I like the war talk coming from the outside. It's a tried and true way to bolster support for a leader. So I don't totally get that premise, but that's just kind of a tangent.
Well, what actually worries me on the tangent of actually caring about the policy outcome is that, the Iranian government isn't a unitary actor. And you have, I think, forces within the Iranian government for whom what you just said is quite true. Then you have forces, and bizarrely and hard to deal with for Americans, Ahmadinejad is among these forces, who would actually like to be the people who got credit for negotiating a deal with the West.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's some minority, maybe not a minority, particularly within the Revolutionary Guard, that would actually like to have more confrontation.
Mm-hmm.
And who would potentially even see benefits accruing to them from a military conflict.
Right.
And
okay.
that's what's scary to me, because if you think about the failed plot, quote unquote, which looks kind of amateurish and strange, and many people have said that they don't understand. That doesn't seem like the kind of thing that the Revolutionary Guard would have greenlighted at the highest levels. But on the other hand, if that had succeeded, it would have been very, very hard for the Obama administration to choose not to make a military response. So you think about these proposals.
Yeah, well, if it had succeeded with a return address, I guess. It would have been, in theory, Mexican gangsters who did it. But anyway, that whole thing, I really, there's something kind of weird about that whole thing. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, the other point I was going to make is, there's been discussion in the GOP primary debates about what a great idea it would be to put more ships in the Persian Gulf. So now you imagine the scenario where one group of guys in a cigarette boat managed to ram and blow up a U.S. ship.
Yeah.
There's no way you don't have a military response. It's very difficult not to have a military response to that.
Right.
And
if you want to get one step more cynical, you're talking about elements in Iran wanting to provoke such a thing. I venture to say there are elements in Israel who wouldn't mind seeing such a thing. Am I being too cynical?
No, I think there's been a very clear public debate about that in Israel, which is one of the fascinating pieces of this, and it's something that's very different, by the way, from the run-up to the Iraq War. The fact that you and I are explicitly having this conversation is different in the American context, but the degree to which there's been an open, vibrant, public debate among citizens, journalists, government officials, and security and intelligence officials in Israel coming out. You have the former intelligence chief saying that attacking Iran would be stupid.
Mm-hmm.
But you've had, for weeks now, a very visible public debate, which is unprecedented, both in terms of Israel internally having this kind of debate about its own security, but also it hasn't happened too often in other societies too, and that's I think a really good thing. Although at some level for statecraft, it's not a good thing.
Now that is, but there's one contrast. There's one other contrast. The flip side of that is a different contrast with the run-up to the Iraq War, which is that, although you're right, there are a lot of Israeli elites who are voicing the opinion that a military strike on Iran would be a bad idea. The position of the government is pretty damn hawkish, and in fact, that's why the former intelligence chief is the former intelligence chief by some accounts, is that there's been a kind of a purge in the national security structure in Israel of the less hawkish elements, so that increasingly you have something approaching unity of opinion in the parts of the government that matter. And to the extent that that's true, to the extent that we have an overtly hawkish government, that's actually a contrast with the run-up to the Iraq War. The Israeli government, on the one hand, yes, neocons in America were pushing the Iraq War, and it was alleged by some people that they were doing this on behalf of Israel. But the fact is that the Israeli government was not, I think, convinced that our invading Iraq was a good idea from their point of view, and maybe now we have a clue as to why. So it's funny. You have these two things. You have on the one hand what you said, vigorously expressed opinion in Israel that there shouldn't be a military strike, but at the same time the government is more determined I would say, to create a conflict than the Israeli government was in the run-up to Iraq.
Well, I want to differentiate between the political party aspect of the Israeli government and the security apparatus, which, interestingly, the security apparatus is not uniformly supportive of military action and has gone out of its way to make that known publicly, which is pretty unprecedented, and which, is, to the extent we have similar debates here, we certainly had them around Libya on a much smaller scale, is a little bit challenging in terms of what the place of the military in a democratic society is. But leaving that for another time, there's not uniformity of opinion among the people who would actually have to carry out a strike, which is very interesting. And I do also think that there's a lot of games being played on a lot of levels here in terms of what the rhetoric around war with Iran is being used for. And I do think in the Israeli context as well, there are people who are deliberately using a loud public debate about military force to try to end up with options that aren't military force.
Oh, sure. I mean, there is this idea that the more they threaten war, the less they'll have to do it. But do you agree that Netanyahu has tried to create a national security structure within his administration? I mean, this is what I've heard, is that he has tried to move doves out or relative doves out of power and create a more hawkish environment internally. Do you think there's some truth to that?
Yeah, I'm sure there's some truth to that. I just wouldn't overstate it.
So there's still opposition within the councils of government there.
Yes. And I think the other thing that it's worth pointing out is that if you look at Israeli opinion polling, you see both, decent-sized majorities saying, yeah, we should strike Iran if we have to, and decent-sized majorities saying we're going to suffer if we strike Iran. So there is this internal
Yeah, but what is
debate
the size saying it would be better for Iran to have a bomb than for us to strike Iran? I would guess that's small in Israel.
Pretty small. But there's something else that actually should get brought in right away that is very different now, and that is the economic set of issues and the war weariness of the American public in particular. And when you think about the potential consequences on world oil markets, and the idea that there's no way that you keep even something that you say is just a very targeted, all we're doing is targeting nuclear facilities, because of the Iranians' capacity to respond asymmetrically, to go after our troops in Afghanistan for the next it's only a month now, in Iraq, but elsewhere in the region as well, to go after Israel, to cause trouble in Lebanon. There's no way that this just stays sort of a little Libya-like bombing expedition. And the public appetite for that is so different from what it was in the immediate aftermath of 9/11.
Yeah, although I don't know how many. You mean in Israel?
No, I actually mean in the U.S.
Yeah, I don't know how many Americans are clear on what a long-term engagement this could become. I mean, as someone pointed out to me, if America gets involved in a military strike to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, we will have established a doctrine that we're not going to let them get weapons. And that will mean, that will commit us and commit us, and our honor and our pride and everything else to making sure they don't get them. And that is basically an endless war that could well even wind up with not just surgical ground operations, but conceivably a full-fledged troop presence. It could well be a slippery slope. If we decide that it's an American doctrine that Iran can't have nuclear weapons, and we start with a bombing raid, it's really not clear to me where that ends.
Well, I think you sort of have to back up from that and say actually every candidate, both political parties, there's basically nobody that I can think of other than Ron Paul who is willing to question that it should be American doctrine that Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. So in a way, we're already there. And of course that it is, in a way, the biggest taboo that you can't discuss in all of this. And, sort of number one, there's the question you raise, is it really so ipso facto destructive for Iran to have a weapon? And then second, the way I tend to frame it is, what are the alternatives? And there, when you get to what are the alternatives, even somebody like Ken Pollack, who of course is no dove, will sort of grimly say at the end of a very long article where he goes through all the alternatives that if the only option is war and a weapon, probably the weapon's the less awful of the two awful options.
Is that his actual position? Has he stated it firmly enough so that he's kind of stuck with that?
Yes, there's an article to that effect which I will link to.
That would be great
for viewers. But as I say, and this is the thing that's so challenging about this debate is that you have a lot of participants in it who feel that they've been very explicit that ultimately going to war with Iran is a bad idea. But either for political or substantive reasons, or some combination of both, they spend so much time using really bellicose rhetoric, or they've decided that really bellicose rhetoric is the way forward, that people who aren't sort of marinated in the field just sort of dip into the debate and hear it as, oh, everybody wants to go to war with Iran. And as I say, if you have a game-changing event on the ground, it's going to be very hard to back off of that.
Right. The presidential candidates are not a reassuring group of people to listen to. On this question, there is a question here about the extent to which, if any, the enthusiasm for war has spread beyond a relatively small group of neocons in terms of America's kind of opinion-making elite. I mean, you clearly have people like Bill Kristol out there. On the other hand, if you want to look at one side of it, you apparently have Ken Pollack maybe saying a nuclear Iran would be better, an Iran with a bomb would be better than bombing Iran, and that's a departure, of course, because he was played really a pretty big role in setting the stage for the Iraq War. You have that, and you have the fact that a number of neocons haven't really officially come out yet, at least. I mean, Bob Kagan is talking a little hawkish last time I heard him, but he hasn't said, I think, that we need to bomb. On the other hand, I saw something a little alarming. I was alerted to it by a post that I think the Leverets posted, and Flint and Hillary. And it was on the Morning Joe, and they had this Iranian official whom you would know. He's from the Larijani family, the eminent Iranian Larijani family. It was Mohammad Larijani, who's an official. They had him on, and it was not a group of neocons interrogating him, okay? It was like Richard Haass, it was Mika Brzezinski, Mike Barnacle, John Meacham, and I mean, the interrogation was reasonably fierce, but then after he left, they talked about him in a way that led me to think, wow, the hawkishness is spreading beyond the neocon circle. I mean, John Meacham said, oh, this man seems irrational, so how can, the implication being, Iran's not a rational actor. I don't know where they got really from what he said, the idea. I don't know where Meacham got the idea that he's really irrational, but whatever. Meacham's not identified as a neocon, but there he was. So we'll link to that, but I would call that a sign that war fever is starting to spread. I would
actually stop you there and say that you have to differentiate between a couple of things. And I think that, again, there's a small group of people who really who go in and see war as the answer, and they're looking for a question. Mm-hmm. And then there's a larger group of people who find Iran alarming for lots of reasons that are real and legitimate. I mean, it's legitimate to be concerned about the nuclear program. Their human rights policies are revolting. There's been an uptick in sort of regional intervention, terrorism, general messing around, which is threatening to U.S. troops and U.S. interests that people who look at intelligence are really concerned about.
Can I stop you there and say, if we're going to be clear about this in our minds, we can't lump things like, if we're deciding whether to go to war, I think we have to be careful about lumping human rights in with, proclivity to actually use a nuclear weapon and with terrorism, which is a different thing. Terrorism is a threat directed at other nations. That's true. Human rights is different. I'm not saying it's not worth worrying about, but I do mean that the very strategy of the hardcore hawks is to make the Iranian regime seem so kind of evil / irrational that it shuts off rational thought on our part. This is a strong parallel with the Iraq War.
The counterpoint to that is when progressives say that we don't care, we don't mention, and we don't lift up the human rights aspect to it, we easily get caricatured as just not caring about people.
Well, progressives don't generally say that.
But listen, actually, but the other thing is, what gets the Iranians' attention in international fora, what really embarrasses them? It's the human rights argument. Where did, the Iranians got hauled in front of the Human Rights Council. They had less support for themselves than the North Koreans had. So where have we been most successful in isolating the Iranians? So we should be talking about human rights at every available moment.
Well, is isolation per se a success? I mean, where has that gotten us?
It got the Iranians to let some people out of prison and pretty up their jails a little bit. So
okay. I meant in terms of the nuclear issue, but
sorry, can I want to finish my point, because I think there is a small group of people who does sort of sees their goal as taking us to war, that would fix something. And then there's a larger group of people who do legitimately start out with a range of issues that they're very concerned about, and legitimately concerned about from a range of ideological positions. And what's happening now, it's not that John Meacham is part of the war party, just to pick on John Meacham at random, but that what's happening now is a squeezing of the options that part of our policy universe sees available to resolve the problem. And the longer you go, and this is where, frankly, the Leverett's approach fails. The longer you go and you aren't able to present anything that feels like it could actually have some effect, then the more of those people you start losing to the, well, there's no other option but war party. Even though they don't start out there, and if you said to them that they are part of a war party, they'd be offended, and genuinely so, because that's not where they started out, unlike Bill Kristol, where, let's not kid ourselves, that is where he started out.
Well, actually, when John Meacham says these people are irrational, they're not rational actors, that leads inexorably to it's better to bomb Iran than for Iran to have a bomb. So it has implications. What he said has implications. Secondly, I mean, do you agree with the point I'm making, which is twofold, which is a strategy of the hardcore hawks in both the case of Iraq and Iran was to get us to think of the regime as so evil and crazy that really that was the end of the debate. Okay, once you've got people compared to Hitler, as we did with Hussein, and it was very important to the Hawks that we call what he did to the Kurds genocide, because then he was Hitler. And
but it was genocide. I mean, just the fact that they said it didn't make it wrong.
Heather, it was a sufficiently terrible thing to do that he should be killed for it. I'm willing to grant you that. Whether it was genocide, whether it deserves to be put under the same label as killing millions and millions of Jews is something I think you could really have an argument about, because Hussein at least perceived the Kurds to be an actual threat to his power. My point is that the name they apply, and this is, I'm glad we're getting here, because this is where the earnest, well-intentioned people who care a lot about human rights can wind up unwittingly in league with hawks.
Now, see, I would put it the other way around, which is that earnest, well-meaning people who care a lot about going to war need to engage early on the human rights issue. So here's I spent the past weekend at this Halifax Security Forum with the Canadian Defence Ministry, and John McCain was there. And there was this very hawkish conversation about Iran, and so I got the chance to ask him a question and tried to push him a little bit. And by saying to him, so Admiral Mullen, Admiral Fallon, General Zinni, Israeli intelligence, there have been all these military and security voices raising really major questions about the wisdom of military action against Iran. How do you contend with that in your decision making? Mm-hmm. And first he told me that I didn't understand what Admiral Mullen said. Which I, didn't take very kindly to, but I figured if he couldn't come up with a better counter-argument than that, I was doing pretty well. And second, he then, not feeling confident that he'd won the argument, he then went on to assert that the Green Movement supports U.S. military action, which is completely and utterly fabricated and wrong. There's a fabulous report, which we'll also link to, interviews of Iranian human rights figures who were willing to go on the record with Western interviewers and say, no, it would be a terrible idea for the U.S. to go to war with Iran. But if people who have serious credibility on human rights issues aren't willing to stand up and say that, then you lose that whole line of argument, as was the case in Iraq. And so I view, personally, for me, my willingness to say, we should be hounding the Iraqis about human rights. More importantly, we should be trying to get the rest of the world to hound the Iraqis about human rights as a critical piece of a strategy that says it's possible and indeed even preferable to care about people's human rights without wanting to bomb them to fix their human rights.
Yeah, but the push to bomb Iran is not explicitly linked to human rights. That's the problem. I hope we make as much progress on human rights as possible. But if you think that making it is going to get the Hawks to go, well, okay, in that case, they can have nukes. I mean, A, they're not going to say that. And B, in any event, I just want to, I do want to push this argument I'm making about the rhetorical techniques that are being used by the Iran. So just hear me out here. I think a common theme in the case of Iran and Iraq is the following. They want to depict the leadership as evil and crazy as possible. And in both cases, the leaders aren't making it that hard to do that because they do a lot of bad things. But the Hawks want you to put them literally in the same category as Hitler. They use the word. And of course, if they succeed in that, then that ends the argument. You wouldn't want Hitler to have a nuclear weapon. You wouldn't want the epitome of evil and irrationality to have a nuclear weapon. So for them, that ends the argument. And I'm just making the point that although, yes, I'm in favor of human rights and doing what we can to safeguard them, the way rhetorically the Hawks use human rights, the human rights issue, is to mix it in, to use it as part of a recipe for depicting them as just bad in all these different kinds of ways, and convince you that they're so bad that the argument is over. That really, I think, is the way, and I've reflected a lot on the Iraq War, because I was against it, and it was a lonely place to be. And I really believe that this was just key. That once they got you to think of him as evil, and that meant, that was, and there they drew on the progressive human rights lobby and so on. Once they get you to think of them as evil and crazy, then the rest is easy. And it's in that context I would encourage people to look at that Morning Joe show. They weren't calling him Hitler afterwards, but if you look at the discussion of that Iranian official after he left, it was really a bunch of people who aren't considered neocons moving the conversation in that direction. And I've got to say, the guy didn't help his case. I mean, for example, he said, America is the biggest terrorist nation in the world. Well, you don't go to America and say that. I mean, it's actually an interesting argument that some of the world perceives some things we do as terrorists, like when we kill tens of thousands of Iraqi civilians. Interesting argument. But he did admit that the guy said it in a way that invites kind of ridicule. At the same time, I think we were seeing the neocon strategy having effect, even though there were no neocons there. And I'm just saying the human rights thing is a double-edged sword, because to the extent that you complain about it, you're singing with a neocon chorus. You may be right that if you can make actual progress, it helps, but it's not. I think it's not a simple matter.
So, a couple things. First of all, I go back to the initial point that I made. This movie started a while ago. And if you look at public opinion polls, the public already has a very, very negative impression of Ahmadinejad and of Iranians. And anytime you try to engage an argument by saying X is not Hitler, that's an argument you have already lost, and you are wasting oxygen. So,
well, I don't know. Is it? I think it's been the case that there have not been many people with enough courage to actually make it. I don't think we've done the test.
Well,
who's made it?
When I think about what I can do to make sure that policy toward Iran stays in a vein that I think is productive, and that I think actually best long-term serves the security of the United States, and what tools I can use toward that end, trying to convince the American public that Ahmadinejad is not evil is not high on my list. Trying to convince
So wait, you're willing to concede that Ahmadinejad is evil in the sense that Hitler was evil?
No, not as a matter of what I intellectually believe, no. In a matter of when I get my 10 seconds with the public, or if I were picking what 10-second or 30-second snippet of this blogging heads was going to get excerpted, I'm not going to waste my time on that. No. What I want and this is something that I think we should have learned from Iraq, and that the economic situations and all the other crap that happened over the last 10 years, the thousands of American deaths, the tens of thousands of civilian deaths, that we do have the opportunity to make is to say, okay, what are American interests here? Ahmadinejad's a bad guy. You wouldn't want him running your country. You wouldn't want the mullahs running your country. You wouldn't want the Revolutionary Guard running your country. Not going to argue with you about that. What are American interests here? How do we serve American interests? And, starting a proxy war, unleashing terrorists against Israel and driving the price of oil up to $250 a barrel is not how we serve American interests. The people who want to do those things are warmongers, are short-sighted, and are the same people who brought you the last decade. That's how I want to talk about it. And then, but the next piece is, okay, so then Heather, fine, what's your answer? Say, well, what do the Iranians listen to? They listen to coherent international pressure. So you actually, as ugly and tiresome as it is, you have no choice but to try to do things that will get Russia and China on board, that will get Brazil and Turkey and South Africa on board. And those, if you've got a comprehensive palette of stuff you're pushing at the UN, including the human rights piece, which, by the way, a hell of a lot more people in the rest of the world care about the executions of teenagers than they care about Iran's nuclear program. So you're just foolish. When you're looking at a global audience, you're foolish.
Not in Israel.
But when if you take, again, that either you've got a unilateral military option or you've got this kind of slow and heaving multilateral option, then you're sort of stuck with working on the palette of things that your multilateral partners care about.
Mm-hmm. Well, here's what I'm saying is that messaging strategy works fine for now, so long as your goal is to forestall war and try to keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. What I'm saying is that once Iran has a nuclear weapon or maybe even breakout capacity, and that seems to be where we may well be headed, in part because I don't really think our administration has engaged in any kind of earnest attempt at engagement in a while, but for whatever reason, I think that may be where we're headed. Once you get there, if you have conceded, as you seem willing to do, that Iran is a crazy, evil country, then there is going to be a war. Because even I would say, if a truly crazy, suicidally crazy and evil country has a nuclear weapon, you should stop it at all costs. So if you've, not at all costs, but at the cost of war. But that's actually not the case with Iran, as any careful study of Iran's history will disclose. There's no evidence of suicidal insanity. And in fact, however bad some of the stuff they do is, especially from our point of view, it tends to be actually kind of part of a coherent strategy.
Well, actually, Bob, I would argue that the North Korean case is pretty counter to what you just said, in that the American public definitely thinks Kim Jong-il is nuts, and I would say they might even be right on that one. I mean, again, I use the word in a kind of joking way, and I do believe countries are rational. Most political leaderships are rational actors by their own interest in dynamics of rationality, which may very well look crazy to us, but in point of fact, there hasn't been a nuclear war with North Korea.
Yeah,
God knows, Pakistan also. So
and remind me how far Israel is from North Korea? I mean, come on, that just fundamentally changes the political dynamics of this question, not just in Israel, but in America, right?
Well, this is where, so this is where the sort of the medium, and I think in some ways, you and I are talking about short-term and long-term challenges, both with respect to how the Israel dynamic changes things in American politics, and with respect to how you talk to the elites about a society. And I do think that the Israel dynamic has less sway than it had 5 or 10 years ago, which doesn't mean it has no sway, but it has less sway.
Well, why are the Republican candidates talking about Iran the way they're talking about Iran?
Christian Zionists.
What?
Christian Zionists.
Well, fine, but that is itself linked to Israel. I mean, certainly the
Bob,
influence.
they matter in a presidential primary.
Of course, but Heather, my point is.
Thank God, it isn't yet the case that we have presidential primaries all the time, although God knows it feels
Heather,
that way.
my point is this. You made the North Korean comparison, and I said the reason that does not work is because Israel is close to Iran and not to North Korea and influences American politics, and absolutely one of the main avenues of influence is the Christian Zionists. So that is what I'm talking about.
Right, but I'm saying that you're overstating the degree that Israel's ability to drive our national security decision making is not as great as people like to depict it as. And God knows I may be back on here in a year sort of eating my words and wishing I hadn't said that. But I think one of the things, and again, going back to this rhetorical problem that I outlined a while ago, one of the things that's going on is that policymakers, and it's a little hard to tell which ones, are trying to define a space for themselves where they can appear to be helpful to Israel without being defined by Israel and being driven someplace they don't want to go. So that dance is happening right now in a way that is not, it's not clear to me that it's going to turn out badly. It's worth worrying about. It's worth thinking about how those of us outside government contribute to it going in a good direction. But there are lots and lots of people who think that the choice to use tough language and push on sanctions and push in an across-the-board way is actually contributing to get to a place where you can at a certain point say, okay, all of these things up to this point were consistent with U.S. security. Going beyond this point, not consistent with U.S. security, we're not going to do it. Israel, we've given you warning, we're not going to do it. So I think it's really important to see that underlying dynamic, whether or not you think it can succeed, but to recognize that it's there.
I'd love to believe that that's true. But what I've seen...
Well, it's true. It's just a question of whether it'll work or not, I think, is what you can fairly ding me for.
What I've seen is that the political environment in which Barack Obama is working right now, in this realm, has been significantly shaped by the rhetoric of these Republican presidential candidates. He's already, of course, thinking about the election. You, by your own account, said that they're catering to the Christian Zionists. So you're seeing the linkage. So I'm pessimistic.
So let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Okay, because one of the reasons that I choose and that National Security Network chooses to work along the lines that we spelled out is that, frankly, I haven't yet seen anybody who's figured out very efficacious ways to change. And again, we're talking about generalist elites here. That once the generalist elite, I'm just not to pick on John Meacham, who I generally quite like, but someone like John Meacham, who's not an Iran specialist, who doesn't think about the issue all day, every day, but then gets confronted with some guy saying a bunch of things that in his construct don't seem very rational. That nobody has yet shown me sort of a messaging strategy or a messenger strategy, frankly, that's going to be very effective in convincing people that Ahmadinejad is an okay guy.
Well,
so what are you going to do?
That's not the strategy, that he's like an okay guy, a guy you want to hang out with. For purposes of deterrence, you have to establish, well, first of all, you and I both know that his days are numbered. I mean, in 18 months...
Well, that's been shifting. I mean, this is the other thing that should be brought up, is that there is an election coming up in Iran. Ahmadinejad had been counted out, had been declared as good as dead, but he's now actually sort of staged a comeback in the last month or so.
No, I thought he was actually not eligible constitutionally for re-election.
No, he's not, but he's trying to put his people forward. It's not nearly as clear as people were confidently asserting 6 weeks ago that he's going to...
So an Ahmadinejad surrogate.
Yeah.
But see, that's not the question, is he a good guy? The question is he suicidal? That is the question for purposes of nuclear deterrence.
But you still haven't answered my question how you're going to convince
Okay, but let me just be clear on what the message is. And B, in general, Iran has not, by and large, been a reckless nation in terms of its national security strategy, I would say.
Although, again, you have the Revolutionary Guard, which does really problematic, reckless things, which is a worry.
Okay, but here's a good example.
Because what I worry about, again, is a conflict starting not because, the Supreme Leader decides to do something crazy, but because some guy in a patrol boat rams a warship, and from there you have escalation on both sides, which isn't the same thing as they're irrational.
That's something to worry about, but that's not worrying about an actual nuclear attack.
But nobody's worried about a nuclear attack right now because they don't have a bomb.
No, Heather. I mean, the point of convincing people that these guys are not crazy, the people who will actually have control of the nuclear bomb are not crazy, I mean, again, I think we're just playing different games. You're trying to forestall war for another few months, and I'm saying the very success of the hawks in shaping the American political environment already makes it impossible that we are going to launch an engagement strategy that might work. And therefore, I'm preparing myself for the significant possibility of them actually having the bomb. And I'm saying at that point, the question is, are they suicidally irrational?
Okay. Well, first of all, there's no engagement strategy that's going to work before the Iranian election. I mean, there's Iranian elections and American elections. So, there is no engagement strategy that is going to work in the next year. Mm-hmm. So what you have to focus on for the next year is making sure that you have a government in the United States that can still have any hope of doing anything other than launching a preemptive strike or letting the Israelis launch a preemptive strike. So that's the sine qua non for anything else you want to do. Second, the more time, I mean, it does presume a two-tier strategy, which is that the more time you buy, that there's this wonderful piece that was done back in the spring, sort of pointing out that every 2 or 3 years somebody issues a proclamation that the Iranians are 2 or 3 years away from getting a bomb, and then they don't get it. So the more time you buy at my level, that time needs to be spent putting out the message about, number one, how can we get the Iranians to choose not to weaponize? How can we get the Iranians to choose to remain in a pre-breakout state and feel that that gives them the regional credibility, prestige that they feel that they deserve? Number two, is the point you made about what does a nuclear region actually, what does a nuclear Iran actually look like in the region? What's the pluses and minuses of that as opposed to the pluses and minuses of conflict? And that's a discussion that has to be had within sort of an elite that's ready to hear about it, at the same time as you're just pushing back on the sort of broadest tactical level the idea that there's nothing to do here but go to war. And so, those two things have to be happening.
I think that's by and large a worthy mission. I'm just saying, I think the chances of it, as I read the politics of it preventing them from reaching at least breakout capacity and getting a bomb are less than 50%. And I'm just saying, in the meanwhile, if in the meanwhile you have let the hawks successfully convince America that these people are suicidally irrational and evil, then you are going to wind up having a war. And you're saying don't have that argument with the hawks. Don't have that argument with the hawks. They'll marginalize you. They'll marginalize you. Well, to get back to how we started, I've seen what happens with the Iraq War when nobody takes them on that very point.
Okay, so
I'm not eager to go there again.
But let's talk about, that seems to me a really key point because, of course, people who did try to take them on were marginalized.
You're telling me.
Since I was in Ann Arbor, I was already marginalized and I was against the war, but nobody cared, so that was just fine. But so the problem is, at the moment, you have a lot of actors who are, if not willing to say under no circumstances would I use force, who are very willing to say there's huge problems with force, who are non-marginal. And so the challenge that I think we're running into is there's people who say, no, you have to go out and make the hardcore, they're not crazy, we can live in a world where they have a bomb set of arguments. And then you have these actors who say, well, wait a minute, if I do that, I'll be marginalized, and I don't want to be marginalized because I'm a fill in the blank. And so the very real, just the pragmatic problem that one faces as an advocate on these issues is how to construct messaging that takes advantage of the best messengers that we have, without saying, so that they can make the argument at the level they're willing to make the argument. At the same time, other people are making the longer-term strategic, what does a world with an Iranian nuke or an Iranian breakout capacity look like?
Yeah, look, as I said, this is all kind of fine. I think a certain amount of it. Well, let me caveat that, as whoever turned caveat into a verb would say, by saying, let me caveat what I'm about to say by saying, I by and large, your mission is one that is important in the near term. I do think there's a little danger. It's a double-edged sword to go around saying, don't bomb Iran, there's still a chance to keep them from getting the bomb. Because that sets the stage. If you fail to stop them from getting the bomb, you have already established this dichotomy of options, right? Where it seems like, okay, well then if we don't stop them from getting the bomb, well then we have to bomb them. So I think there's that danger in a little bit of the messaging you're involved in. But
well, actually, I think there's this problem that there's this whole continuum, because there's a large swath. I mean, most of the people who can get in the paper saying don't bomb Iran are using the message you just used. If I'm doing it, what I would say is it's a mistake to bomb Iran. There are other ways to arrive at a solution that ensures everybody's security, because I do think, my personal view is that the best outcome we can look for is a negotiated solution where Iran is near a breakout capacity, and it's very clear to everybody that Iran is near a breakout capacity.
Okay, then let me just say a lot of the progressive messaging, I think, is a double-edged sword. And I also want to say, just to clarify, I'm not saying, run around saying, these guys are okay, you know, these guys are really okay. I don't believe that, and I don't want to, and it's not an effective thing to say in any event, but I do think someone should be out there, not necessarily you, and maybe someone who is suicidally irrational, like me, I guess, should go out saying things like the following. You know, just little points, like when this alleged plot is uncovered, which again, it remains so weird that I'm not clear on what this plot actually was to assassinate a Saudi ambassador. And people start saying, man, when you start assassinating people on foreign soil, that you're just in another league. Someone should be pointing out that somebody's been assassinating Iranians. And I'm pretty sure it's Israel, and they may have been supported by America. And in any event, when it happens, we all nod and wink and go, well, this is the way you do business if you're a sophisticated national security type in Washington. Okay? So I think it's worth pointing out.
Can I ask you a question
Sure.
about that? Because on a sort of moral, do we have a clear vision of who we are in the world and how people see us? Absolutely, yeah, it's worth pointing that out. If your goal is to help Americans feel like they can live with a nuclear Iran, why the hell would you go out of your way to point that out? You have to decide
Heather,
which thing you
I'm
want.
telling you, Heather, because the key strategy of the Hawks is to subtly, incrementally, inch by inch, depict the Iranian regime as crazy, irrational, fervently religious, whatever it takes. And this is one little inch of progress for them, more than an inch. That, wow, these guys were going to assassinate somebody on foreign soil, and they don't care if innocent bystanders get killed. Can you imagine? Yeah, I can imagine. Our close ally Israel does it all the time.
But
and we support it.
I just don't know who that argument makes traction with in our society the way it is right now. I mean, I'm not arguing, I'm not disputing it as a substantively and morally correct argument. I'm just saying it doesn't get the attention of the people whose attention you want to get.
Well, it doesn't immediately reach middle America.
No, it doesn't immediately reach the generalist elite, who are the crucial people that you need to reach.
I don't know. I think there are, like you take a John Meacham. I think...
I was trying not to invoke
that's a perfect example of a guy who, judging by what he said on Morning Joe, doesn't think this stuff through and goes with his gut. And yet he is an elite, and he is an opinion leader, and presumably if you sit him down and point some things out, he can realize that some of these arguments or some of these generalizations are not as clear-cut as you might think about who's good and who's evil. Look, maybe it's naive and maybe it's hopeless, but, you know, what else is there to do? Yeah,
no, I don't think it's hopeless at all, actually, for reasons that are larger than messaging, I want to hasten to say, because way too much of this conversation has ended up being about messaging. I don't think it's hopeless, because I do actually think we're in a situation where when you sort of sit down and do a cold, hard national interest comparison, this just makes no damn sense. And I think we've got a decent chance, because people's minds are more focused on that than they were in 2001, 2002, that we're gonna get there. But I'm just gonna end with one of our favorite messaging truisms, which you and I have both heard so many times. You're gonna want to throw the camera at me. But when the facts don't match the frame, it's the facts that are rejected, not the frame. So that's the problem.
Wait, what's the practical application of that? I haven't heard that, actually.
It's a very depressing... If you have a frame in your head about how the world works, and you hear a fact that doesn't fit with your frame, that you already have, you just reject it.
Well, that's my argument. Don't let them do the framing.
But it's all, if you look at the opinion polling on what the American people think of Ahmadinejad in Iran, we are past the point that you can litigate whether Ahmadinejad is a bad, crazy,
he
expletive deleted.
He may well not even be in office when this comes to a head, if it does, okay?
Yeah. And he's never had the power to declare war.
That's why the Hawks are already shifting from demonizing Ahmadinejad per se to demonizing the mullahs.
Yeah, I mean, which at least is correct in as much as they're the ones that make the decisions, not Ahmadinejad.
That's worth pointing out, too, is he's probably not the guy with his finger on the trigger. Okay, so that's right. I think, that is sadly true what you said. In closing, just in defense of myself, I want to say that, however quixotic or crazy, one of the things I'm recommending, which is that we just try to be consistently reasonable about this, is that I do think, in general, the biggest problem of the world is the inability of people to really evaluate the other in anything approaching an objective fashion, and the facility with which we all conclude that we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. Believe it or not, Iranians believe that too.
Republicans believe that too, of course.
Republicans and Democrats. And so it's partly just kind of my general hobby. I maybe don't bother to ask often enough whether there's actually any point. It's just like golf. It's just a hobby.
Well, everyone needs a hobby, right? Well, this has been great fun.
Yeah.
We'll do it again.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Heather.
Yep, you too.
Okay. Bye-bye.